In the quiet corners of English history, beneath the thunder of famous queens and legendary monarchs, lies a story so unsettling, so strangely forgotten, that even scholars speak of it like a ghost rushing past their pages. A story of a little girl who was handed a crown before she could read her own name, a child promised to a king nearly 5 times her age, a bride whose fate was sealed long before she ever learned what the word fate meant. She was born into a world where thrones mattered more than childhoods, where alliances were forged in cradles, where royal blood carried a price heavier than any crown. And so, when the tiny princess, barely 6 years old, her hand small enough to disappear inside the folds of her silk sleeves, was carried into the grand hall of a castle she had never seen before, she did not know that she was walking into history as one of England's most tragic, overlooked queens. The king she was promised stood tall and distant, 29 years old, battle-hardened, admired, feared, and already shaped by political storms she could not possibly understand. To the courtiers whispering behind jeweled hands, the arrangement was nothing unusual. To them, she was not a child, but a symbol, a tool, a move on the great chessboard of kingdoms. But to the little girl, whose feet barely touched the floor when seated, whose dolls still slept beside her pillow, whose nursemaid still tied ribbons in her hair each morning, this shift from innocence to royal duty was like being pushed into a world where shadows grew taller than people, and where every smile hid an expectation she was too young to name. They said the king was kind, that he admired her lineage, that he believed she would someday grow into a queen worthy of England's throne. But kindness in royal courts was a slippery thing, changing shape depending on the politics of the hour, and admiration meant little when weighed against the cold machinery of dynastic ambition. Yet even in that foreign echoing palace of embroidered tapestries and stone corridors, the child bride's presence stirred something unexpected in the kingdom. Curiosity. People lined the streets to see her carriage, not out of malice, but because they could not fathom a queen so young, a bride whose feet dangled when she sat, a royal whose crown looked more like a heavy toy perched awkwardly on her soft hair. But beneath the spectacle lay an unspoken discomfort, one the nobles drowned in celebration and the common folk whispered about only after nightfall. Why must a child be married to a grown man? Why must innocence be traded for diplomacy? And though such questions floated through the air like unacknowledged ghosts, no one dared voice them outright. For in the world of crowns, power spoke louder than conscience. As the years unfolded, the child queen's life became a tapestry of contradictions. She was adored, yet misunderstood, praised, yet silenced, dressed in gold, yet never allowed to choose the colors for her own gowns. Her days were filled with tutors who recited lessons she struggled to follow, advisors who bowed to her while simultaneously speaking as though she could not understand a word, and servants who smiled politely but never truly saw her. Even the king, her husband in name only, treated her with a curious blend of responsibility and detachment. He gave her gifts, tiny rings that slipped off her fingers, books she could not yet read, miniature crowns meant to prepare her for the future, but he never gave her the one thing she needed most, a voice. She watched him from afar, this man who was supposed to be the center of her destiny, and she wondered why he always looked so burdened, why he seldom smiled, why he listened so intently to counselors, but never to her, why he moved through the palace like a storm cloud carrying secrets she was forbidden to know. When she asked her nurse why the king seemed sad, the woman only offered a soft, rehearsed answer. A king's heart carries the weight of a kingdom. But the girl sensed there was more to it, something unspoken beneath the polished surface of royal obedience. She sensed it in the way guards stiffened when his name was mentioned, in the way servants scurried at the sound of his footsteps, in the subtle tremble in the air when he raised his voice behind closed doors. And though she was merely a child, the palace's moods pressed upon her like invisible hands shaping the limits of her world. She began to understand that the crown she wore, though light, though decorative, was the early shadow of something far heavier that would one day demand everything from her days melted into months and months into years. And as she grew, so did the whispers. Will she be ready? Will she understand her role? Will England accept a queen forged from an alliance rather than destiny? These whispers seeped into her dreams, turning them into labyrinths where duty chased her like a relentless creature. And still, the king remained distant, never cruel, never unkind, but always unreachable. Sometimes she wondered if he saw her not as a person, but as a promise, a future political shield, a living emblem of peace between warring factions. And perhaps he did. Perhaps that was the only way a grown man could rationalize being bound to a child not yet old enough to write her own letters. Yet, despite the emotional gulf between them, she observed him with an alertness that surprised even herself. She watched how he carried himself during ceremonies, how he spoke to soldiers with a stern but measured tone, how he navigated heated council meetings with a mixture of diplomacy and fire. She watched him the way a child watches a distant mountain, towering, impressive, unreachable. And slowly, piece by piece, she built an image of what her future might demand. But childhood, even royal childhood, cannot be drowned completely. Sometimes she escaped her tutors and ran barefoot through the palace gardens, laughing with the pure, wild freedom she feared the adults would someday forbid. Sometimes she fed crumbs to the pigeons near the stables, whispering secrets to them because they were the only ones who never corrected her or bowed too deeply. Sometimes she stared at the horizon and wondered what lay beyond the stone walls that both protected and imprisoned her. And sometimes, late at night, she cried quietly into her pillow, not because the king frightened her, not because the palace was cruel, but because she did not know who she was allowed to be. Was she a child or a queen? Was she a person or a symbol? And would she ever be given the chance to choose? The palace musicians played soft melodies during feasts, but none of them could drown out the growing ache of uncertainty inside her. She knew change was coming. She felt it in the shifting glances of the court, in the sudden urgency of her lessons, in the way the king looked at her sometimes, not with affection, not with desire, but with a calculating sadness, as though he knew her path would be hard, and he could do nothing to soften it. As she approached her 12th year, the world around her began to tighten. Her tutors stopped treating her like a child. Her attendants whispered of responsibilities she was still too nervous to hear. And the king, now approaching his mid-30s, grew quieter, more solemn, consumed by political storms that raged around England like restless spirits. The girl who once chased butterflies in the garden now sat through endless councils trying to decipher the tension that pulsed through every conversation. She sensed danger in the kingdom, rebellions brewing, alliances weakening, enemies sharpening their blades in faraway lands. And for the first time, she truly understood why the king's eyes so often carried a shadow. The throne she was destined for was not a seat of glory, but a battlefield dressed in velvet. But what no one realized, not the king, not the advisers, not even the trembling kingdom, was that beneath her gentle demeanor and childish innocence, the little queen was beginning to grow a spine of steel, not the loud, boastful strength of warriors, nor the calculated aggression of politicians, but something quieter, deeper, forged from years of watching, listening, absorbing, a strength born from silence, a strength that would one day make her far more formidable than anyone expected. And as she crossed the threshold between childhood and adolescence, the air around her shifted. The court began to look at her differently, as though finally seeing not a child bride, but the glimmer of a future monarch. And in that moment, she made a decision, one that would shape the course of her life and rewrite the legacy history tried to bury. She would not be a forgotten queen. She would not be a pawn. She would learn their world, master their secrets, and one day stand tall not because a king allowed her to, but because she earned it through the quiet fire of a girl who had been forced to grow up too soon. But destiny, like a storm gathering beyond the horizon, had plans neither she nor the king could foresee, and the day that storm finally broke would change everything. As the seasons turned and the young queen stepped further into the fragile space between adolescence and duty, the palace around her seemed to shift its weight, as though the walls themselves sensed the storm tightening its grip on England. And though she tried to hold on to the fragments of childhood that still flickered in her memory, each passing day pushed her deeper into a world of sharp decisions and veiled threats, where every whispered conversation carried consequences and every gesture was measured not in innocence, but in power. The king, who had once regarded her like a distant promise, now began to look at her with something closer to apprehension, perhaps recognizing that the child he had married for political convenience was awakening into a young woman whose mind absorbed everything: his triumphs, his failures, his enemies, his secrets. And that awareness unsettled him in ways he could not admit. Political unrest roared through the kingdom like an invisible wildfire, fed by noble families who resented the king's authority in foreign courts, who watched England with hungry eyes. And in the heart of this turmoil, the young queen found herself pulled into the gravitational field of decisions far larger than her years. Her tutors drilled her relentlessly, forcing her to memorize treaties, study family lineages, learn the delicate art of negotiation, and understand the fragile architecture of the kingdom she was destined to help lead. Yet, beneath the weight of those lessons grew a quiet defiance, a sense that she was more than a ceremonial figure, more than a girl trapped in golden cages. She began to attend council meetings uninvited, slipping quietly into the room with the poise of someone who believed she belonged there. And though the counselors exchanged uneasy glances, the king allowed her to stay, perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of reluctant admiration, perhaps because he finally sensed that history was shaping her into something he could no longer control. She listened intently, soaking up every detail: the rising tensions with France, the treachery fermenting among English nobles, the whispers of betrayal that seeped through the court like poison. And with each revelation, she understood more clearly the burden the king had carried alone, not because he wanted to, but because no one around him could be trusted enough to share it. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the girl he once viewed as a symbolic alliance became the one person in the palace who saw him as a man rather than a monarch. Their interactions changed. He asked her opinion in private. He explained strategies she did not understand. He revealed pieces of the truth he had kept hidden, even from his oldest advisors. And though she was still young, her insight surprised him. She saw solutions where he saw walls, possibilities where he saw only threats, threads of diplomacy woven through the chaos that he had overlooked. She did not flatter him. She questioned him. She challenged him. She made him reconsider choices hardened by years of ruling alone. And it was in those quiet, candlelit conversations that a strange bond, neither romantic nor paternal, but something more nuanced, more human, began to form between them, a bond that softened his hesitation and hardened her resolve. Yet the kingdom was not patient. Enemies circled like vultures waiting for the king to falter, and rumors began to spread that the young queen was manipulating him, that she had bewitched him with her growing intellect, that she was a foreign storm gathering at the center of English power. Every compliment she offered him became, in the eyes of the court, a calculated move. Every suggestion she whispered became a threat. Every moment they spent strategizing behind closed doors was twisted into something scandalous, something dangerous. And though the king defended her publicly, the whispers sank their claws into his insecurities, pulling him back toward the fear that had shaped his rule from the beginning, the fear of losing control. Then one winter night, as snow dusted the castle roofs and the moon cast a silver glow over the courtyard, a rebellion ignited, not from foreign enemies, but from within the English aristocracy. A faction of powerful nobles, long resentful of the king's decisions, launched a covert movement to remove him from the throne. Their plan was swift, brutal, and designed to shatter the kingdom before dawn. The young queen was the first to sense something wrong. She noticed the way guards avoided her gaze, the way servants whispered too quickly, the way a cold dread settled in her stomach without explanation. And when she overheard two knights murmuring about the hour approaching and the king's final reckoning, she realized the danger was not months away. It was minutes. She ran through the darkened corridors, breathless, searching for the king who had spent years shielding her from the darker corners of his world. When she found him alone in the council chamber, studying a map by torchlight, she saw exhaustion carved into his face, an exhaustion so deep it seemed to seep into the stone floor beneath him. She told him what she had heard, and for a moment he simply stared at her, as though trying to reconcile the small girl he had met years ago with the young woman now standing before him, trembling but determined. Then the realization struck him like a blow. The revolt he had feared for years was no longer a possibility. It was here. The attack began moments later. Steel clashed in the corridors. Torches were knocked to the ground. Loyal guards fought desperately as the rebel nobles pushed toward the king's chamber. The queen stood beside him, refusing to leave even when he demanded it, insisting that her place was wherever England's fate was being decided. Together, they fled through a hidden passageway that twisted beneath the castle like a serpent's spine, a secret only a handful of monarchs had ever known. The air inside was cold and stale, the darkness suffocating, and the king struggled to keep pace, weakened by sleepless nights, political strain, and years of emotional burden. More than once he faltered, leaning against the damp stone walls, but each time the young queen took his arm, urging him to continue, whispering that England needed him, that she needed him, that they had come too far to fall now. When they finally emerged into an abandoned stable outside the castle walls, they could hear the chaos behind them, flames crackling, soldiers shouting, the heavy thud of battering rams striking wooden doors. The kingdom was unraveling. The king knew he had two choices: flee and regroup, or turn back and face the revolt head on. And though every instinct screamed that escape was the wiser option, he looked at the queen, this girl-turned-woman who had grown in the shadow of a crown too heavy for her years, and felt something shift inside him. He realized the rebellion was not just against him, but against the future she represented, the future she might yet shape if she survived this night. And suddenly, he knew what he had to do. He placed his cloak over her shoulders, guiding her toward a small carriage waiting in the shadows, one of the emergency routes planned long ago but never used. He instructed the driver to take her to a safe fortress miles away, where loyal forces still held the banners of the crown. She refused at first, her voice breaking, insisting she would stand beside him, fight beside him, die beside him, if necessary. But the king shook his head with a firmness she had never seen before. "You are England's tomorrow," he said, his voice strained but unwavering. "They want to erase me, but they fear what you may become." And with that, he shut the carriage door despite her pleas, giving her one last look, an expression that carried apology, pride, regret, hope, and a lifetime of unspoken understanding. As the carriage pulled away, the queen pressed her hands to the window, watching him grow smaller against the firelit sky, knowing she might never see him again. By dawn, the rebellion had reached its climax. Loyalists fought fiercely, but the king was ultimately captured, wounded, and overwhelmed. Records claim he died defending the last unburned wing of the palace, but eyewitnesses whispered something else, that he stood tall until the final blow, refusing to surrender, refusing to kneel, and that his last words were not a curse against his enemies, but a quiet plea for the young queen's survival. When news of his death reached her, she did not collapse. She did not scream. She stood perfectly still, her face pale, but her spine unbroken, and vowed that the man the world had judged harshly, the king who was her husband by law, her mentor by necessity, and her anchor in a world that never gave her a choice, would not be forgotten. In the years that followed, she rose not through inherited authority, but through a fire-forged strength the kingdom had failed to predict. She navigated alliances with a precision that silenced her critics, neutralized enemies who once mocked her youth, and rebuilt England with a vision shaped by both compassion and steel. And though history tried to swallow her name, burying her legacy beneath louder monarchs and convenient narratives, the truth lingered in the quiet places where her story first began. A 6-year-old girl forced into a marriage she never chose, who grew into a queen the world did not deserve, one who carried the memory of a broken king like a torch through the darkness, determined to illuminate a path no rebellion could erase. And it is said that in her final years, when she walked alone through the palace gardens at dusk, the wind carried a faint echo of a man's voice, a voice shaped by regret, loyalty, and love, misunderstood by history, whispering that she had fulfilled the destiny he never had the chance to finish.